We at Jibe don't believe in swearing for the sake of swearing, but we also don't believe in censorship. Please be advised the following contains coarse language. This is Jibe, the rebirth of conversation.
I'm sure you've all been out somewhere and while trying to discuss something with one of your friends, they whip out a cell phone, start texting, and immediately their once engaged dialogue turns to sounds of yeah, and then finally trails off to maybe just nothing at all. And you think, do I need to start my sentence over again? Have they heard the story? Do they understand the problem? I don't know if they're texting or updating a status, and you just don't know where to go from there. Now, I've done it. You've done it. We're all guilty of it, and I'm not here to preach at that. With new technology, the world becomes a harder place to focus, and the results have led to an increase of medication across the continent. This information isn't necessarily new. However, one Saturday morning, I was flicking through a list of YouTube TED Talks when I landed upon Philip Zimbardo's TED Talk called The Demise of Guys. I was troubled because, well, it's a troubling title, but also being that I was already aware that universities were beginning to see less and less male students, it had always been a bit of a personal theory that today's generation of North American boys were struggling. And then there it was, written in front of me, on YouTube, at a TED Talk, The Demise of Guys. And to my female audience, the conversation isn't meant to exclude you. In fact, it affects you as well, perhaps in a different way, and perhaps in a way that you weren't quite aware of before. Here's what Mr. Zimbardo had to say.
Guys are flaming out academically, they're wiping out socially with girls and sexually with women. Other than that, there's not much of a problem. So what's the data? So the data on dropping out is amazing. Boys are 30% more likely than girls to drop out of school. In Canada, 5 boys drop out for every 3 girls. Girls outperform boys now at every level, from elementary school to graduate school. There's a 10% differential between getting BAs and all graduate programs, with guys falling behind girls. 2/3 of all students in special ed, remedial programs, are guys. And as you all know, boys are 5 times more likely than girls to be labeled as having attention deficit disorder, and therefore we drug them with Ritalin. What's the evidence of wiping out? First, it's a new fear of intimacy. Intimacy means physical, emotional connection with somebody else, and especially with somebody of the opposite sex who gives off ambiguous, contradictory, phosphorescent signals. And every year there's research done on self-reported shyness among college students, and we're seeing a steady increase among males, and this is 2 kinds. It's a social awkwardness. The old shyness was a fear of rejection. It's a social awkwardness, like you're a stranger in a foreign land. They don't know what to say, they don't know what to do, especially one-on-one opposite sex. They don't know the language of face contact, the nonverbal and verbal set of rules that enable you to comfortably talk to somebody else, listen to somebody else. There's something I'm developing a theory called social intensity syndrome, which tries to account for why guys really prefer male bonding over female mating. It turns out from earliest childhood, boys and then men prefer the company of guys, physical company. And there's actually a cortical arousal we're looking at, because guys have been with guys in teams, in clubs, in gangs, in fraternities, especially in the military, and then in pubs. And this peaks at Super Bowl Sunday, when guys would rather be in a bar with strangers watching a totally overdressed Aaron Rodgers of the Green Bay Packers rather than Jennifer Lopez totally naked in their bedroom. The problem is they now prefer asynchronistic internet world to the spontaneous interaction in social relationships. What are the causes? Well, it's an unintended consequence. I think it's excessive internet use in general, excessive video gaming, excessive new access to pornography. The problem is these are arousal addictions. Drug addiction, you simply want more. Arousal addiction, you want different. Drugs, you want more of the same, different. So you need the novelty, you need the arousal, you need to be sustained. And the problem is the industry is supplying it. Jane McGonigal told us last year that by the time a boy is 21, he's played 10,000 hours of video games, most of that in isolation. As you remember, Cindy Gallup said boys don't know the difference between making love, men between making love and doing porn. The average boy now watches 50 porn video clips a week. And there's some guy watching 100, obviously. And the porn industry is the fastest growing industry in America, 15 billion annually. For every 400 movies made in Hollywood, there are 11,000 now made porn videos. So the effects very quickly is it's a new kind of arousal. Boys' brains are being digitally rewired in a totally new way for change, novelty, excitement, and constant arousal. That means they're totally out of sync in traditional classes, which are analog, static, and interactively passive. They're also totally out of sync in romantic relationships, which build gradually and subtly.
Now, I have a minor in psychology, and that's enough perhaps to scratch the surface on this issue. However, I wanted to talk to somebody more at the expert level and dig a little bit deeper. As luck would have it, one of the bartenders at one of my favorite watering holes here in Toronto has gone on to become a clinical psychologist, who in fact did many of his practice hours in a high school where his clientele were mostly young men. The conversation was meant to focus more on ADD and ADHD in today's society, but quickly developed into much more. Will Groenewegen joins me on this installment of Jibe. You're now walking into that conversation. And your practice is ramping up?
My practice is ramping up. In fact, I just got a new client this evening.
Give me an example of like what you, if I'm calling you, what are some of the questions you'll ask? I'm kind of reserved. I'm afraid to tell you what's wrong, but I know that I need to talk to somebody. Yeah. So I call you and say, hey, look, like I got your number from a friend. I know you're a good psychologist. How do you start to dig to find what I need to do?
Well, the first thing I do is try to find out that if the issues that are being brought forward work well with my modality, which is a CBT modality.
Client-based.
CBT is cognitive behavior therapy.
I was way off.
So CBT is, very briefly, it was developed starting in the 50s, but it's a modality of human understanding where it looks at thoughts, feelings, and behavior as three facets of human functioning that are interconnected, necessarily interconnected. So just say you're having behavioral issues, then you don't have to necessarily focus on the behavior. You could focus on the emotions, or even better, the thoughts that make you feel and therefore act a certain way. So for CBT people, they think, you could start at any of those 3 points. You could start at the thoughts, you could start with the emotions, or you can start with the behavior. But the most powerful way to start is with the thoughts. And try to find out the underlying thoughts that are leading to other keywords that I look for, like anxiety, anger, depression, anything to do with existential angst, freedom, purpose, meaning, things of that nature.
Okay.
That's my starting point.
So it's, okay, so I guess you aim at the thoughts because that is kind of the root cause, so to speak, of everything else that's kind of popping out or lashing out as a result.
This modality believes that, the most powerful way to influence like a maladaptive cycle, if it's going on, is to focus on the thoughts first, because we are most in control of the thoughts that we have. So if someone, say, is feeling really angry, it's not that effective to say to them, well, be less angry and like work with the emotions. Yeah. But it's deal with it or blah, blah, blah. But it's more productive to think about the underlying thoughts that are stimulating or perpetuating that anger in the first place, and then examining those thoughts, because most of them are what we call false beliefs or automatic thoughts. So basically thoughts where you're your own biggest bully, which is a lot of people's problem. Yeah. We're like, oh, no one could ever love me, or I'm not good enough, or I'm not a man enough. And then these thoughts that often we're not even aware we're having will influence the way we feel and the way we behave. Right. Yeah. So then people kind of act out, or they let those underlying thoughts kind of guide them subconsciously. Exactly. So for example, I used to be a high school teacher. So if I'm teaching a lecture, say say at the college level.
Yeah.
And I noticed that during the course of my lecture, 2 people got up and left.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody with a maladaptive cycle in terms of thoughts, behaviors, and emotions might think, oh, well, they're leaving because I'm a boring person. They're leaving because I suck. And of course they're leaving because I'm a bad teacher.
Right.
And that's going to influence the way they feel the next day and later that day, and it's also going to influence the way they behave.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas another teacher could see 2 people leaving their lecture hall and say, oh, well, they're very busy people just like I am.
Mm-hmm.
They must have really important things to do. And that thought will influence their emotions and behavior entirely differently. So, exact same scenario, 2 different underlying thought patterns going on lead to 2 completely different ways of living and having psychological health.
Right.
Yeah.
So you factor all these in when people call you for like, they fit your motif or your background.
Exactly.
You walk through them, and then it's okay. Come in for a more in-depth chat.
Right. And there's some words that I get scared of too. So, for example, I'm not a relationship counselor. I'm not an addictions counselor. So if people bring up words like that, then more likely I'll refer them out to colleagues.
Right.
The other one for me is if people that are very religious come to me, I can, because I'm personally aware of my own biases when it comes to organized religion and how that affects freedom of thought and mental health in general, I tend to steer clear of those as well, even though it would excite me to not.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, a lot of people are going to counseling to feel happier, or at least to make their anxiety or depression a little bit better, not to have this huge existential deconstruction and reconstruction, which is what I would want to do if really religious people came to me. Like question their beliefs instead of getting them happier.
Right.
So because I'm aware of my own bias with that, that's another thing where I would maybe refer it.
So people would walk in and say, God hates me, or
that's right.
I grew up believing in God and I feel like he's abandoned me. That's kind of, it's
exactly.
too far.
Exactly.
Right.
Because in fact, one of the things that we look for as cognitive behavior therapists are types of thinking that we would call personalizing or magnifying. So oh, this thing happened to me because the universe is really mad at me, or God's really mad at me, or taking things really personal, or magnifying a situation more than it needs to be. And if you're a really religious person, then you actually do think that someone is personally intervening in your world and punishing you or rewarding you, and that can, for me, get in the way of cognitive behavior therapy interventions and techniques to help.
Right, and a lot of people will kind of let the world navigate them and blame some of their follies on more like karmic type backgrounds. So if they say, yesterday I cut off somebody and gave them the finger, and then today I got fired. Right. Is that something you would see too, that you would kind of refer out, or is that something you would tend to try to work with if it wasn't necessarily God-based?
Yeah, in both cases, it wouldn't be necessarily out of the question for me. I guess it depends on the level and it depends on the goal that people are looking for when they come to therapy. But yeah, that's another example of something that might, a way of thinking that might take a long time to unearth, and some people might not be ready for that. Yeah. Some people might just want to feel a little bit happier than to reconceive everything that they've ever believed about reality. Right. Even though I'm up for that. If you're up for that, I'm up for that as well. Yeah.
So you're part-time philosopher, part-time psychologist.
Yes. My first degree was philosophy at U of T. Right. So that is my kind of undercurrent.
I saw the Nietzsche book on your counter.
Right.
Are these questions that you're? I want to ask you a bit about what sort of traits go along with very anxious people, but I also want to find out, are most of your clients that you deal with men? Boys, men?
No. I would say 2/3 are men, are males. And at the moment, only one of my clients is a teenager, and he comes in with his father. So for part of the session, they're 1.5-hour sessions, and for part of it, I have both of them in the room together. For part of it, I kick out the teenager, and for part of it, I kick out the dad, and I have one-on-ones with both.
Do you find yourself intermediating a lot between the two? So-and-so, the younger one might say, XYZ, and then father, XYZ is causing your son to do blank.
Yeah.
Do you find yourself, or is that kind of overstepping?
No, I'd say that in that case, for that particular duo, the father and the son, that part of the reward for going to therapy anyway is for them to hang out and talk to each other and get angry with each other and be happy with each other. So I'm pretty good with being in the middle of any kind of domestic. In fact, it's very insightful to see how the father and the son interrelate with each other.
I would assume too, a lot gets lost in, I don't want to say translation, but a lot of fathers and sons just don't communicate unless it's through yelling. So I'd imagine a lot of things perpetuate just based on, I think he thinks blank. And it makes me angry because I think that's how he thinks.
Definitely.
Whereas if you put them in a room, they get chatting, and I would imagine it leads to some heated debate.
Plus, there's a stranger there, so they might act a little nicer towards each other, which works for more productive interaction and development in their relationship.
Cool.
Yeah. But I used to be a guidance counselor at a high school. Briefly, I did, when I was doing my master's degree in counseling psychology, I did a placement at Central Tech, which is an inner city high school here in Toronto.
That's at Bathurst and Harvard?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So when I was there, most of my mandated clients, I guess you would say, were males. Although lots and lots of females, but I had a lot of experience with teenage boys coming to me with either and I say mandated because I would have a list of kids who either skipped class or were getting really bad grades, and I would sometimes call them individually down to my office to talk. So that's what I mean by mandated, but also I had a lot of drop-ins once I was there more and more, and they knew that, I was the Friday psychotherapist counselor guy. That I ended up having a bit of like a following with some of the young men.
I could see that, yeah.
And we talked about, things like how to talk to girls, things of that nature.
I'm glad you mentioned the about talking to girls, because we hear in that TED Talk that men or boys kind of all over are falling off the map. And one of the things that they're saying that they're really struggling with is social interactions. So, I mean, what would be your first advice to... Are these the common traits of struggling to talk to women, or are they kind of a new kind of unheard of field that is new for the digital age?
Yeah, I think it's both. I'm sure that it's an age-old problem.
Right.
Teenage boys wondering how it is to most effectively talk to women, to get what they want, and vice versa, women and girls talking to boys and how to do that. But I think that in today's modern technological climate, there are certain new and paramount issues that have never been seen before.
Right.
And I've certainly noticed that as a guidance counselor and psychotherapist.
Would you say that some of it would go back to some of the issues are with fidelity? Because now everybody's got each other's cell phones, and there's really kind of a lot of blurred boundaries as to what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. If he has a boyfriend and he gets a text from another girl, or she has a boyfriend, and I know that, but I want to reach out to her anyways. I can do that now a lot easier. Yeah, this open social landscape and lack of privacy. It's a good point you raised, because I'm sure that does have a lot to do with these questions that they're having. But I think more than that, it has to do with this lack of FaceTime that young people are getting. Right.
So even though they're being extremely social, in fact, it's even called Facebook.
Right.
But actually, this lack of FaceTime is having, I would say, devastating effects on young people, and maybe even especially young boys who are more prone to spending time in front of screens instead of people.
Right.
But it's a sexless problem. So I'd say that males and females are both finding it. There's this new terrain of how to relate to one another. It's all uncharted waters. But they do say, correct me if I'm wrong, women are better at reading facial expression than men. I'm not sure the stats on that. It seems to make sense. I certainly know that females do have a better time interacting with technology than males do. For example, or with media even. So, for example, women are more likely, and I'm actually taking this from a more in-depth read at the TED Talk.
Yeah.
It's actually a book, right? The Demise of Guys.
Yes.
And so I was reading a bit more about the book, and he does talk about that, how women females have an easier time kind of picking and choosing from what media gives us and what technology gives us.
And you say picking and choosing, you mean what's important and what to throw away.
And throwing it into their own narrative and being their own people still with it.
Yeah.
Whereas boys and men tend to look at media and be, and really just want to be that superhero character that they see.
Yeah.
So they can't pick it out and incorporate some sort of realistic part of it into their daily life, but they have a harder time doing that, and they're more prone to want the whole package.
Okay, so men are looking at say the movies that have all, and lately, since the recession, a lot of the big blockbuster films have oddly enough focused on a male hero. Mm-hmm. So men are probably are they looking at that, you're saying, and saying that they identify with that person and assume that they can be that person, and it's
and if you add that into the kind of philosophy of how the baby boomers raised their kids
to be me-centric.
Exactly, which is kind of this article that I found really interesting in the Time magazine, the Me Generation.
Yes,
there's actually some interesting things in this article that we might get into later.
There are, and so the Time generation, or the Time headline is me generation, the me generation.
The me generation.
And there's been a lot of that coming out, whether it's McLean's, whether it's Time, whether it's even Upworthy has had videos about Generation Y.
That's right.
And that
1980 to something. Right?
Essentially, yeah, it's 18 to 34, 18 to 32, in that zone. Mm-hmm. So to bring it back on point, we're in a society where we can get all of our social interaction almost by computer screen. Women are better at filtering out what's important, what's
Potentially,
not.
some studies do show that.
Yeah.
And also what I was going to say from that article in the Time magazine is that, we've been promised, or not we, but, the generation slightly younger than us, or maybe it includes us as well, we're fairly young guys, that we were promised this world.
Yeah, and we've seen our parents come through that world.
That's right, and in fact, every other generation since the New World was established has always left the next generation in a better position than their own. Mm-hmm. This is the first time that hasn't happened, even though the baby boomers promised their children that they could do whatever they want. Self-esteem was of the utmost highest regard. They're all special princesses and princes.
Yeah. And
so when a young man takes these promises, watches video games and movies, and has been promised that they can be whatever they want, then why wouldn't they be able to be exactly like the people that they're seeing, these unrealistic characters that they're seeing?
Who fall into these categories. And so to bring it back to the ADHD and the ADD and the men failing, is some of this acting out and hyperkinetic behavior, because that's not a new thing, is some of this stemming from the fact that maybe we're just lashing out? And I say we as men, mm-hmm. but kids in general that are just hyper, and they look at what they have to accomplish to be successful, mm-hmm. and maybe they just say, you know what, that's not for me, because it just looks like a mountain of work and I don't know how to get there.
Mm-hmm.
It's more of a philosophical.
The pressure to succeed has never been higher.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to live in Japan and teach there, and it's a daily occurrence when kids jump off
suicide nets.
Because in this country, I think it's like, depending on what university you get into.
Yeah.
Or in America, maybe especially, like if you get into Yale, then you're doing well, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And you'll have a great job and everything is going to be okay with that. But in Asia, that kind of happens even in high school.
Yeah.
Or if you don't get into the right high school. So anyway, it's just all this pressure. It's definitely maybe that you have a lot of men or boys or teenage males deciding to drop out because it seems like it's just too much. Perhaps that is part of it.
Well, and if they say, by the age of 21, the average North American male has played 10,000 hours of video games.
That's right.
And video games are
mostly in isolation.
Right. Very stimulating games, very reward-driven, constant rewards, and very stimulating. And there is some satisfaction in it and when you complete a level or whatever. So is it, you look in real life of all the things you have to do very slowly and work very hard to get through those goals versus I could just play 10,000 hours of video games and get sort of that same innate feeling that I would by graduating from Yale.
It's a good point. It's a great point. And so why not choose that one instead, right? Yeah. I feel that there's a few things. One thing I wanted to mention, maybe before we dive deep into the ADHD, is one more point about how this isn't necessarily a problem for just males, but that the me generation, the technologically advanced generation, that's getting more stimulation than any batch of humans in history.
Right.
So one of the things I think that technology is doing, and that now smartphones are doing, etc. And one of the reasons why this group of boys would always come up to me when I was a guidance counselor and talk about, like, how do I talk to women? What do I say? Is that I was filling the role as a guidance counselor the way that like an older brother,
or
an
a
uncle,
father even.
a father would do. But America is the most fatherless country in the world right now, which is definitely a factor.
And Canada's not far behind.
Yeah. And Canada's not far behind. But another interesting fact, and this was actually from this me generation, is that, to develop into a full adult, it's said that it's very important to hang out with many people of different ages.
Yeah.
Grandparents, parents, uncles, aunts, the whole gamut. But what's going on now is that because with your Facebook and your smartphones, 17-year-olds can just hang out with 17-year-olds.
Yeah.
And it's much easier to just stay in that very narrow demographic.
And not learn.
That's right, and not get any perspective from older siblings, uncles, fathers, grandfathers. There's a lot more, as you said, thousands of hours in isolation. Yeah. All you do is talk to people your same age. Of course, arrested development is going to occur. Yeah. And I think that's where we find ourselves today.
I guess arrested development is kind of a good way to define the whole issue. It's funny that you should say, I think even in my own childhood where my parents were always very hands-on, but my immediate family, other than my sister, lived 3 hours away. So, I'd see my grandma, Oma, the grandparents, maybe once, twice a year, uncles once or twice a year at most. Whereas I was in Holland visiting my extended family, and the uncles all live on the same street as the grandma and their brothers and sisters, and the nieces and nephews are on the same street. And literally on Sundays, the day is reserved from 10 a.m. until 3 p.m. You're just you walk the block with your family, stopping at other people's house, having cookies, coffee, beers.
That's right. I was before you got here, I was watching this little clip of Michael Moore, famous documentarian, talking about ADHD.
Interesting. Yeah,
and what he was saying was, when I was the age of all the boys, I think it's 85% of Ritalin and Adderall are being prescribed to boys in America. He's like, when I was the age of these boys now that are being prescribed, there was no there wasn't really the term ADHD, which is an 80s term. Yeah. And although there was Ritalin because it started in the 50s, it wasn't just like being dispensed like no one's business. And that's what Michael Moore would say. He said, when I was younger, we would cook together, eat together. There was we would play music together. There were things that we would do as a family that aren't done now. If they were done more now, perhaps the alienation and isolation in conjunction with all of this very narrow demographic that boys relate to, perhaps the problem would be less.
Interesting. Yeah. And before we dive, and we keep scratching the surfaces of this ADD thing, because there's so much more to it than that, especially in the digital era. And I've been wanting to have this conversation for a long time. But I'm curious to know, you had a following of young boys coming to your office for guidance counsel. Of the girls that came to your office, I'm sure there were some. What were the similarities in their struggles? I'm sure there were some definite overlap.
Yeah, I think that generally speaking, the issues were similar, but from my perspective, it was very much more pronounced with the young males. So, relationships, school success, future careers, all of these things were of the utmost important to both sexes.
Yeah.
But the struggle, I found, was really with the teenage boys.
Really?
Where they were feeling, left behind in class. And of course, with ADHD too, with this so-called ADHD.
Right. It's all hypothetical.
Well, yeah, like, ADHD, I'm not saying it's not a real thing, but if you look at ADHD and people being diagnosed with ADHD, it's just completely ramps up.
Yeah.
In conjunction with, pharmaceutical lobbyists. And there's a whole gamut of reasons of why it's going on. But, I found that definitely this was more of an occurrence and a problem with boys in today's education system.
And do you have any theories? I mean, we've kind of talked about like family video games. Yeah. The average male now can get pornography at a second's notice.
That's right.
All of this ties in.
That's right.
Is there anything more to that you think might be causing this, or?
I do. So together we've already spoken about some of the technological reasons why it might happen. Overstimulation, this new lack of patience because everything's just being bombarded at us so quickly.
Right.
Talk about that. Talk about social factors like less fathers in the mix, more fractured families, less social skills, and being able to less skills in how to talk to women and girls because you're spending more time in front of the screens. So yeah, we can talk about those things. But also there's the education system,
right,
which I think is partly to blame. So for example, we have this education system that, in its foundation hasn't changed since the Industrial Revolution, since Enlightenment Europe.
That's a good point.
Where you farm these groups of people by the same age, as if that's the most common thing that people have with each other.
And we all know that women or girls are beyond boys in years maturity. So
That's
you're
right.
already kind of offsetting it.
Indeed. And the way that we look at education from this enlightened European, this is again since the advent of the public school system,
right,
is that success is academic success. So you're smart or you're not on this very deductive, reasoning kind of smart.
Right.
So that's what the academic success is from. If you succeed, if you are that kind of person, and again, this kind of system has worked for some people, but it's left many other geniuses just tragically on the sidelines. Yeah, because it's a very narrow definition of what success is, and that hasn't really changed. So if you can't sit down and learn your times tables and not fidget in class, and if you are motivated by experiential learning, well then tough luck for you.
Yeah.
And this really affects a lot of boys, more than girls.
What boy doesn't fidget in class?
That's right. Recesses are getting smaller and smaller. You're supposed to sit real quiet and things are getting standardized. Mm-hmm. So if you have one method of learning for everybody, and maybe it favors women because perhaps women have girls and females have a easier time with the sitting still. So if you don't fit into that mold, then they medicate you. And teachers will go to principals and social workers and call in parents and say, I'm going to put your child in a remedial or special ed school unless you medicate them. So I think it's also the education system, this outdated way of learning, especially in given today's climate with technology and the way that education and knowledge is transferred to keep people fidgeting. I think that in the DSM-4, which is kind of like the psychiatric handbook of how you diagnose people, for ADHD you need 6 of the 9 check marks in order to get medicated. And like some of this laundry list of potential ADHD signifiers are just like things that normal people do. So do you find that the child is, I think I remember it because it rhymes, what is it, fidgeting and moving their feet and finding it difficult to stay in their seat. Okay, well, yes, that's most boys, so check mark.
Check mark.
And if you get 6 of those 9, then they pop those pills, and that's like the way of dealing. Instead of fixing the education system, you get pharmaceutical companies very rich, and you over-medicate a group of children. And again, Michael Moore was like, if they had done that to me, because I fit definitely 6 of those 9.
What boy does it?
And I wouldn't have made Roger and me. I wouldn't have made these things. You wouldn't even hear about me because I'd be drooling on the sidelines.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I don't mean to put the I don't want to say blame, but I don't want to handicap the boys. But I taught tons of swimming and hockey and yada yada yada.
Right.
And teaching the girls class was always a joy, especially in hockey.
Right.
Because the girls, they'd come and say, Coach, what do you want me to do?
Right.
I want you to do this, this, and this. And then you see them 30 seconds later, and they're doing that, and that.
Right.
Right? Whereas the boys, it's a little bit more, you got to keep them in check.
Yeah.
I had an OIC teacher who used to say, if you were fidgeting or you weren't paying attention, even tapping your pen, she'd just point at you and say, you're leaking. And that was if your attention right now isn't on me, it's leaking out of you as you tap your pen. Tap, 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 tap. So to tie it back to the Michael Moore statement, if he had been medicated, he'd be drooling on the sideline and not being the creative kind of genius that he is.
Yeah, and again, he didn't say drooling on the sideline, but what he did say was if I had been medicated, I would not have made. He doubted that he would have had the success and been doing the things that he did.
Okay, so let me ask you, if the typical boy genius or girl genius who doesn't quite fit the mold of the current paradigm for education, and they're lashing out, and you medicate them, and what is the immediate effect? Do they actually sit down and fly right, or is it just kind of they're quieter and they seem to pay more attention?
No, I think it would be the latter. I don't think that it's definitely not a fix-it drug. It could be like a hold on to the status quo kind of drug. But in all cases, and again, I don't want to necessarily make this a bash Ritalin conversation, because there are certainly times and people, in fact many people maybe, where it would be helpful, but the root cause of these problems can't be fixed by the Ritalin. That's definitely, I think.
That's kind of a metaphor for our whole society. I have X problem. Can you give me this pill?
That's right.
So when, in keeping with that kind of line of thought, when they come off the drug, let's say they go on it at 8. As an 8-year-old, you're kind of crazy, lashing out, hyper. They give you this drug, and then you're on it for what's the maximum amount of time you can be on it, or is there a maximum amount of time?
I actually, that's a great question. I'm not sure what the regular. It seems to me that the people that are on Ritalin take it for an extended period of time, and in a routine way where behavior is often checked, and the duration of each pill, will overlap with the next one. So there isn't so you're really actually changing the person, as long as they're on the pill, pretty well permanently, unless they forget to take it.
Right. And so let's say there's no real hard and fast date that they come off it. But let's say, hypothetically, for the sake of this conversation, they're on the pill from the age of 8, and now most students are leaving university at the age of 22, 23. Do they come off it when school is done? And what happens to the way they think and to the way they act once they're off the pill?
I think that these are really interesting questions that, in a sense, we'll have to wait and see.
Because we're not there yet.
Yeah, it's kind of like how the first women that took birth control in mass, like in general populations, are now just old women now. So we're still figuring out side effects of that pill.
Yeah.
And I think that this over prescribing of Ritalin is so recent that I think we'll have to wait and see. But definitely you're changing brain chemistry, and you're probably creating dependence. So getting off of it might be very, very uncomfortable for people.
It might be, again, going back to the first part of our conversation, if you're having a bad day, it's the universe's fault, or it's somebody else's fault. It might almost be as though you may not know how to function without that pill.
Yeah.
And if you do something stupid, it's like, well, I didn't take my pill that day.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's always an excuse.
Yeah.
On that topic of medication and kind of being reliant on it, I meet a lot of professionals now who maybe never took any Ritalin, any Adderall. Mm-hmm. And I've had this conversation, but I've had a lot of friends who are in school and they think, I can't focus. Mm-hmm. Because probably, and this is men and women, they've got Facebook, they've got text, they've got Twitter, what you name it, cable, there's great shows these days. Mm-hmm. And they say, I can't focus. And they seek out either borrowed, I put that in quotation marks, Adderall or borrowed Ritalin from people who are actually prescribed it, or they go to their doctor and say, I need something to help me focus. Where's this dangerous and how is this wrong? You can answer one or the other or both.
Well, from my mind, I try to advocate for a chemical-free type of psychotherapy and in human living in general. So, in some cases, personally with my clients, just say you suffer from depression. Mm-hmm. And a pill really will actually quite help you out. I think that the worst case scenario is that there's a hybrid between medicating someone and having talk therapy.
Yeah.
So I never advocate for recreational, even if it's recreational, like Ritalin or Adderall use for. I can see why people would want to do it in this. There's so much pressure.
Yeah.
There aren't that many jobs. You really want to get it. There's so much distraction and overstimulation. Why not take an Adderall or actually, in case in point, I have a good friend of mine who he had a 15-page Freud essay to write, and he had never taken, to my knowledge, Adderall or Ritalin. And a friend came over and was like, "Oh, I have one. Do you want to take it?" And he did, and he stayed up all night. And gosh darn it, he wrote an A+ paper. Yeah. The next day. I don't even know if he ever took Ritalin again. Yeah. But he took it that night. And he got an A paper, and he wrote that Freud essay so well. Mm-hmm. So it seemed to work for him. But of course, over time, perhaps the effects are much, much different. Yeah.
Well, is that an option? Perhaps, I guess, if you're not in a day-to-day schooling base, you can't just have it at will. Yeah. But if you're in class and you're at a university level, you're in class 3 days a week. You've got 5 assignments per term. Yeah. Maybe 5. You have kind of 5 midterms and then 5 finals. Right. So what if it's a circumstantial?
In my mind, if you have to take chemicals to try to succeed in a normal way, then you're barking up the wrong tree. You're down the wrong path. So, even though there's Band-Aid approaches, I think that what we're actually talking about are like systemic problems that need to be addressed, not Band-Aid solutions like recreational Adderall or Ritalin use or whatever, right? So what I'm more interested in is what are the underlying factors that could be addressed so people don't need to pop pills.
Why do you need this?
To feel that they're keeping up with the average Joe. Yeah. So why not change the way that we look at education? Or why not really make a considered effort to raise our children more in nature-based or experiential outdoor education programs where they learn how to interact with people in different ways, problem solve in different ways, problematize in different ways, and learn a new kind of patience that things like outdoor nature activities get. When I was a guidance counselor, I took these kids north of the 401 to a forest to build some forts and spend time in nature. And I was surprised because, I'm sure you've heard of nature deficit disorder. It's not in the DSM, but it's something that's on a lot of people's tongues because, living up in a city, and that's another factor we didn't talk about, is the urban factor and what it is to be a man or a boy and have a certain kind of skills when you've never been to a forest. So I took these kids up, and these inner city high school students, some of them had never been in a forest before.
And it's a whole new world.
And I was like, what? Because I'm a camper like you. I love camping, and I'm in nature all the time. And to hear that these kids have never been in nature, and then to see them actually work with each other in the nature, it was very, very rewarding.
Yeah.
But more of that, I think, would also be a great step.
Well, actually, there is, to that point, a Japanese were implementing this as a form of depression treatment, was more forest time.
Yeah.
You get out of the city and you spend an hour a week on a hike. And even that, people were reporting huge difference to their demeanor, to their happiness, and to their overall sense of worth.
Yeah, and I think that science even agrees with you. There's studies been done that show that even, like smelling plants achieves this chemical in your mind, or this or that about being immersed in nature, and the link between nature and mental health is very, very strong indeed. It reminds me of an article I was actually reading about ADHD and gaming.
Yeah.
Because some people argue that gaming is a lot to do, has a lot to do with this lack of attention and this ADHD that kids have.
Yeah.
And there certainly is a link with the more video games you play, the higher inattention that you have. So the lower attention, higher the gaming, the lower the attention that you have. So there is that link. Other studies suggest, well, maybe gaming can be good for people with ADHD.
Yeah.
Because they are so stimulated.
Yeah.
Maybe using games to help them feel like they are succeeding is a good thing. And they have these studies where they've actually made games where the gamer is rewarded only when their brains are using I think it's the beta waves, right? So they hook up the kid's head with these nodes or whatever.
Yeah.
And you can actually only do things in the game if your mind is producing beta waves, which is like the focused, more relaxed waves.
I think I glanced. I read that article very briefly.
Oh,
yeah.
Right, there you go.
I just kind of did a quick Google search and I came across that website.
Yeah, and whereas most gamers are in, I think the theta wave.
Theta waves, yeah, and those are the ones where you're tuned out.
Right. So in terms of the special video games with the nodes on your head, perhaps that works. But at the end of the day, studies suggest, and it seems like common sense to me, that turning off a video game and going outside and using your body is better for your mind.
Right.
And better mental health comes with this exercise.
Yeah.
So even though some people argue, well, maybe we have to rethink, don't just hold your nose at video games, maybe they can be helpful.
They're a piece of the puzzle, but they're not the be all and
all
for either side.
That's right, because it's kind of paradoxical, right? In some senses, video games are good with people that are understimulated but have ADHD. Yeah. But the paradox is that the more that you play them, the higher that the problem is going to be.
Right.
So the best thing to do is to actually turn the game off and go make a fort in the woods with your friends.
An hour of game, 2 hours of outdoor.
Exactly, yeah.
How much, and I don't know if you've come across this in any of your studies and any of your I guess clientele, but how much of what we call ADD and ADHD, how much of that is a first world problem?
I think that, like depression rates, ADHD rates are very aligned with the first world. Mm-hmm. So, in a sense, when your day is filled with making sure that your family is fed, and other basic, more survival issues, then these problems like ADHD and depression are kind of like not as important, because what's important is what's vital about life is what's being dealt with. I think that part of so yes, I think it is a first world problem. Not just because we're already clothed and fed, so we don't have to worry about that.
Maslow's hierarchy. Yeah, exactly. We were born already with half of Maslow's triangle checked off.
Indeed. So yeah, I think that it is definitely a problem that is more seen just because we're at that point with the first world than in other cultures, definitely. So
we had mentioned last that being in urbanite settings, and having this immense pressure to succeed, but already kind of being born into half of what we need.
And I think that also is in line with this whole, if there is one even, this whole man crisis, this crisis of masculinity that a lot of people are talking about these days. Yeah. These books are being written like Man Up,
Manthropology,
all these things like what is it to be a man now, and perhaps in other cultures it's less of an issue because people are just getting by and trying to survive. Perhaps it is more of a first world problem, an urban, global, technological problem. And so I find that one very, very interesting. In fact, a lot of my male contemporaries, are talking about this. Like, what is it to be a man now anyway? Yeah. You know, for the bulk of human history, anywhere from 50 to 200,000 years, it's been like a patriarchal ordeal where men have ruled the roost and our roles have been pretty, pretty straightforward. And
your primal urges were met. And by that I mean, you the typical hunter and gatherer, that is what you were.
That's what you do. Your roles are defined. In today's day, women are figuring out what is it to be a woman now for the first time. More women are graduating university. More women are succeeding than men in many ways. Yeah. But men are also thinking the same thing. What is it to be a man? So it's not just like it's just a men's problem. Women are thinking about what it is to be a woman. Men are thinking about what it is to be a man. Transsexuals are thinking what it is to be a transsexual. Really, humans are rethinking. We're rethinking in this global, shift, international world what it is to be a human.
Yeah, and when you say international world, the world as it is today, you don't have to go out and fight for your own food. Yeah, and when I walk by you in the middle of the night, you're not. Well, you might be to an extent, but you're not really overly worried I'm going to bash your head in with a rock.
That's true too.
There's this whole shift of what it is to almost be human.
Exactly. I think questions that we've never really had to answer before in the ways that we are now, with technology, with urban living, with global capitalism, with more rights for women and more power and equality going to women. I think that it's a crucial question to ask, what is it to be a man in the 21st century? But I don't think of it as like a huge problem the way some other people think about it. If you ask some of of the women I know that are our age in Toronto, they might have a different story though. They often come to me saying, "Will, I can't find a good man." Yeah. And indeed, to be a straight woman in Toronto, it's really tough to find a partner because more and more men are playing video games and living in their parents' bedrooms when they're 30. They don't know how to talk to women, or they have addiction issues. Yeah. To find a dapper man that has his shit together is harder now. Yeah. There's lots and lots of beautiful, successful women. So, and the average man could, more easily score this beautiful woman to take home to mom and dad, and they'd be like, "Wow, that's fantastic." Yeah. Yeah. But I am hearing from a lot of women that it is hard to find a man that's in his mid-20s to mid-30s
on the intellectual level of that woman with his life together. No, and I see that unfolding everywhere, and that's why this TED Talk. Yeah. When I first saw it one Saturday morning, I literally said, "Wow!" You see it unfolding all around you, but to have it verbalized at a conference for intelligentsia, and you think, okay.
And I think at the very end of that TED Talk, he said something like, it's the women that should be really worried. Like, like if you want a man that knows how to make love slowly and not just do porn.
Not just do porn.
Can they have sex and not do porn? Can they do this and not just do that? It's getting harder and harder. And seriously, beautiful women are always coming up to me. Or not always, but often come up to me being like, I just can't find a man that has his own apartment and has his own job, that's not riddled with addiction, be it like internet addiction or drug addiction or knows how to pay bills.
Yes,
it's an interesting problem.
Or even they don't view their girl, or they don't view that woman as an object, and And by that I mean I have I won't list whether they're friends or enemies or not, but they'll tell you stories of what has happened, and I look at them and say, your life isn't a porn video, right? Yeah. Where they say, she didn't do this or this after the date, and you just want to kind of slap them and say, that's not a normal expectation to have.
It's a very good way to put it. Expectations.
Yes.
Right? Unrealistic expectations. And I think that a lot of people have these, whether it's because your parents promised you that you'll be able to be whoever you want, and then it doesn't happen, so you get really disappointed and frustrated that you're not in the position that you were promised as you were growing up. So you find yourself in your parents' bedroom or parents' basement,
right. Wherever
video games and being single or whatever it is.
Well, on the talk they say men watch upwards of an average of 50 porn clips a week.
Right.
That right there.
Yeah.
If you are a single 30-something or a single 20-something, if you're watching 50 porn clips a week, I don't want to do the math on that, but between 17 and 25, let's say, that's setting a precedent that isn't real, and it's setting some horrible boundaries for what you expect your date to be.
I remember once, he was 16 years old, he came into my office at the high school, and we got into talking, and we got into porn. Started talking about pornography, and this kid had no idea that women had pubic hair, because he just seen
he's so used.
He just seen hairless women on the internet.
For the people who can't see me, I'm actually grabbing my head right now. Not for a theatrical poignancy either, just because I can't believe that.
Yeah. So I think that where we have to go from now, or from here, where we have to go from here is to realize that we are living in a certain system, right? So teachers and guidance counselors are taught to not be repelled by Facebook, for example. Yeah. But to use it to try to understand the younger generation. Yeah. And until an energy apocalypse happens, we are going to be continuing down this path. So what we have to try to do is figure out ways that we can teach and impart to the younger generation that we know is going to be very, very internet and technologically savvy. Yeah. Ways in which that we can help them, grow up to be functioning, healthy members of society. Yeah. So if that means regulating use, like I think it should, getting into nature, or outside, or having as many real-world connections, or turning off the TV and eating dinner together, going to see Grandma and Grandpa a little more, then I think that we should do that. But I think that definitely what we shouldn't just do is look at this as black and white, blame what's going on, and because there's just no way to stop it. Like, this is who the Generation Y is. So I think that it's going to be a hard balance, but what we have to do is try to enforce these old classic ways of interacting, while seeing what can be done, in the reality in which they're living,
to embrace the new.
To embrace the new and make sure that that the new doesn't take us so far off course that we have no idea how to relate, how to be in a relationship, or how to grow up.
One foot in the past with the eyes to the future. I think that's a good way. That's a good place there, I think, to leave it. I think you've wrapped it up quite nicely. So, perfect. Will, thank you very much.
It's my pleasure.
For joining me here on Jibe. And I think we covered the gamut, but certainly I hope this is not the last chat we have.
Can't wait to talk again.
That was clinical psychologist Will Groenewegen. There's always more to be discussed, and you can certainly pick up the conversation at any time with the hashtag Jibe Radio, or you can tweet me directly at Jibe Radio. Thank you for coming along, and until next time, stay curious.
Let me stand on your shoulders so that I can see the giants back home. I've been hanging off the roof of heaven, and my fingers start to roam. So don't buy this quick release to sell your limbs. They only want your song.